Hello. I'd like to introduce you to a process called the Venus sequence. And the Venus sequence is a way of using our relationships to open our hearts more. It's about mastering the art of love. And one of the things, it's part of the Gene Keys teachings, and the centerpiece of the Gene Keys teachings is called the art of contemplation. So when we learn this art, which is the first thing you learn as you come into the Venus sequence, then you learn how to apply a contemplative approach to your relationships. And part of contemplation is gentleness, patience, and self-inquiry. So everything in your relationship then serves the purpose of teaching you more about yourself and ultimately teaching you how to love more. So even the negatives then, their purpose becomes to teach you how to love more, to teach you how to be a more loving person to yourself and therefore to others. And that completely changes the whole approach to most people to relationships, because many times we go into relationships looking for something from the other. And if the thing you're looking for is to learn to love more, then you can never actually be disappointed. You can never be disappointed. So your whole reason for being there changes. That's the primary foundation of this process called the Venus sequence that I want to invite you to explore with me. The other thing I was contemplating recently is equality in relationships. And I came to this understanding inside myself through my own relationship, really, that equality isn't 50-50. And we behave often as though it ought to be 50-50. It has its own wild kind of balance. I'll give you an example. Often in relationships, there are things that irritate us about someone we live with or someone we know well, little intolerances. And often you might think, well, you both do things sometimes that irritate the other. And often you're like, well, if I'm going to change this pattern, then I'd like you to change that pattern because that feels fair, that feels balanced. But it doesn't always work that way. It's not up to you to make the other one change their pattern. It's up to you. The only thing you can control is change your own pattern, right? But there's a part of us that sometimes goes, but that's not fair. If I change this, you need to change that. And so you have to ask yourself, what is it going to cost me to give this up, or to change this pattern? And then if you manage to change it in yourself, regardless of whether the other person changes something that annoys you, it's like you do what you can do. And then suddenly love blooms again. It no longer matters whether the other person does something or not. It's your responsibility to change your side. And this is what the Buddhists call skillful means. It's the application of our intuitive, contemplative insight to a challenge in a relationship. And what it does is it creates more love, right? And it's not always 50-50. So we have to overcome sometimes those deeper embedded little boy, little girl parts that go, it's not fair. It doesn't matter if it's fair. If it creates more love, surely that's what it's all about. That's why I call this inquiry. I call this Aikido, relationship Aikido, because it's about Aikido is a martial art where you reconcile differences and opposites. So when you learn how to use the Venus sequence, you learn much better how to manage conflict in your relationships, and you create a climate in which love can blossom and bloom, and things like arguments, that they're much less likely to occur because you're creating this climate. And there's nothing wrong with arguments. Sometimes they're needed. But this climate where love blooms is really the key to a successful relationship or an enjoyable relationship. So a lot of this process of learning from your Venus sequence is a learning about how to make compromises, and the difference between inner compromise and outer compromise. We have to make many outer compromises, but it's very dangerous to make inner compromises because then you're compromising something deep inside your soul, and that can really harm you. So lots of things you can learn. Love is a Zen master, in the view of the Venus sequence. And one of the other things is that, like doesn't always attract like in our relationships. Sometimes it does, but generally it doesn't. Generally you end up living or being partnered to someone who drives you a bit crazy. My example is I'm a spiritual teacher and my wife isn't really into spirituality at all. She's spiritual, but she's not into any of this stuff, And so it's like there's a complete place where we don't meet. And also I'm the son of a wine merchant, and a long lineage of wine lovers. And I have a deep appreciation for fine wine. And my wife doesn't drink, These are things where you're oh, we don't get to enjoy wine together. And and there's lots of those in our relationships, there's lots of those things. And yet, if you can really reconcile those inside yourself, then it doesn't compromise the love. It doesn't have to. And you have to find the places where you are like someone on the inside, but your behavior can be very different. The key is really respect. To respect the other. And another key is humor. You need humor in life. You need humor more than anything in relationships. If your relationship doesn't share humor, it's a slippery slope. It can be very tricky. So what we do in our relationships, what we learn through the Venus sequence, is we learn to use the difficulties to our advantage, and we don't waste energy. You don't waste energy trying to build bridges where the river is really wide. You find the places where you're closer together and you build your bridges there, and that's how we connect with each other, and that's how we make the most of our relationships, and then love can really bloom. So you can apply these Venus sequence teachings in all your relating. You don't even need to be in an intimate relationship right now, because many of us have, for example, family issues or long-term resentments or wounds with people that we love or are supposed to love, And when you start applying the art of contemplation through your Venus sequence, then all kinds of breakthroughs can come. Your heart begins to soften and open. And what we do is we use non-love to create more love. And that's the essence of the Venus sequence. That's what I'm inviting you to explore with me. How to use negative patterns to create greater harmony. What a thing that is. I can't think of a single situation in the world where that would not be welcomed as the most essential teaching for any human being to know. How to create more love out of non-love. So come and check it out. Come and explore the Venus sequence. Come and find out some of these gifts that you can then apply to your life and your relationships, and see how wonderful that can be when love starts to blossom again in places where you never thought it could. So, yeah. Look forward to seeing you.